Oh, wow, wow, wow. I'm so excited today to speak to Matthew. And it's the subject for us today is social innovation, something that seems to be extremely, extremely important subject in this tumultuous, if that's the right word, time of lockdowns, pandemics, and all sorts of upheaval and radical change around the world. But before I go into any sort of like philosophizing, Matthew, please tell us who are you? How do you introduce yourself these days?
So hi there. I'm Matthew, and I support social innovators. That's basically what I do. One of the big things is a lot of people don't know they're social innovators.
Mhm.
So quite a lot of my work is explaining to people that they are social innovators, and that's why they're having all of the problems that they're having, and that those aren't inherent with them. So really, that is fundamentally my work. It's about making positive change in the world.
Okay. And so before we actually go into who are social innovators or who are the benefactors of such process, what is the purpose of social innovation? I've first well I've heard about social credits or social value, right? And social companies for a long time. But what is social innovation? What's the purpose of it?
Well, I think quite a lot of people have heard of social entrepreneurship
Hmm.
and the ideas around things like social enterprises and some of
Yeah.
that stuff. And that's a big part of social innovation, and it's a very visible part of social innovation. But actually, for me, social innovation is something rather broader, and it's happening all over. And it's something that we've always done. It's just that it hasn't really had a name, and it hasn't had a defined set of practices and an approach. And it's really fundamentally about opening up an opportunity and changing the systems and the relationships that we have within ourselves and between other people so that more people can get access to whatever it is that they need without that costing others. So it's really about this kind of positive sum opening up of opportunity in new ways and facing new challenges, which obviously is pretty relevant to the situation we're currently in.
Yeah, so talk to us a little bit about the people, that are involved in social innovation and how perhaps you got into this whole field, and how does innovation impact people? I think I can
Mm.
chuck a cluster of questions at you to just kind of get you to open up on that people front, so to speak.
Yeah, well, I mean, social innovation impacts all of us all the time. And that's one of the really interesting things about it. It's actually quite hard to see and separate out. It's always connected. It's always part of a bigger picture. So that's actually one of the big challenges. It doesn't exist in this discrete space. But in terms of the people that I'm kind of engaging with and tend to work with, some of them are social entrepreneurs starting their own enterprises and social enterprises. Some of them are academics. Some of them are working for large commercial organizations that want to do things slightly differently. Some of them are working for learned kind of organizations, professional bodies, those kind of things. Um, so it really is quite a wide range of different people. But what unites them is this strong sense that things would be better if we approached them differently and figuring out how to do that. Because very often the challenges that we face in this space are pretty easy to state, but they're very hard. So this simple but hard problem is often a marker of the kind of stuff that we're talking about. And some people are just drawn towards those problems. Those kind of people are the kind of people that I work with.
Mm. So you like people who think not just in terms of product or just in terms of money or just in terms of systems, but all those meshed in a sense making way.
Absolutely, and the human side as well. So it's meaningful on all levels, and I'm a big believer in joining it all up, and that we can make this situation where it makes sense with product, it makes sense with an organization, and it's a financially sustainable, growing organization, so that we can spread that positive impact out and grow that impact and connect with others. Because an awful lot of the people I work with are purpose-led on some level. You know, that's often why we end up when we start having the conversation. They've got a purpose that they want to express somehow.
Mhm.
But a lot of the existing purpose-led approaches are very kind of the traditional charity model, and they don't necessarily get a life of their own. You know, it's about giving money and having a project, and great, that's fixed, we move on. These kind of problems never really go away. We can work with them, we can resolve them and ease them, but we can never make them go away. So because we can never solve them, that model doesn't tend to work, because the system just shifts back as it did before once the funding goes away. So I'm interested in this slightly different way, which exactly as you say is connecting all of these things up.
And so when it comes to then systems, is there something specific about your approach, or even what is the, I'm going to chuck, like, I think with each one of these areas, I'm going to chuck a bunch of questions at you, and you can handle this, I know. But is there something specific to your approach, and what is the system or process or approach to social innovation? Is there something prescriptive, or is it very much sort of emergent and dependent on circumstances?
Well, it is contextual. It's always contextual, and this is one of the big challenges in this space. But that doesn't mean it's completely open. And this systems design is actually a really big challenge in this space, because you don't want to have a fully prescriptive system. You don't actually want to be taking people down an exact path, because the context matters. Yeah. And different people will have a different perspective, and it's really, really hard to make a tool that is open enough to give the freedom that it wants, but still gives guardrails and still helps scaffold the kind of change that you're creating. So for me, systems have, really, it's about principles. And the principles that I'm interested in are creating systems that are open, in the sense that they're open, they can connect with others and interface with other systems well, and also largely that where they're digital systems, that they're based on open source, because it's actually a much more connected way of working, and it means that others can then interface with you, you can interface with others, so you can build that connection. But it really is, yeah, it's a very interesting and ongoing challenge how we develop in this way. And I think a lot of the existing systems models and metaphors are a big theme in this work, because we're talking about big, hard to grasp things, and the metaphors that we use and the tools that we therefore use actually have quite a big impact on the outcome. So the big systems and metaphors that we're using really do, you know, are core to the change of social innovation, and building that is a big part of this. So it's in much more principles and development rather than there being a fixed system.
Yeah, and I sometimes at least think about it, if not refer to it as semi-structured approach. You have a kind of a framework, but it's not overly prescriptive. It's more of a descriptive rather than prescriptive approach. And so in terms of innovation, then, you know, I think most people will find most people are confused by the word innovation. And I think in some respects, I'll blame it squarely, and I'll call myself British too. I'm a naturalized British citizen. I'll squarely blame it on us British, that we've invented this notion of marketing innovation, where if I paint a mug a different color, it's a different mug. As opposed to just a different color mug. So what does innovation really mean, especially in the context of social innovation?
Okay, yeah, I agree. Innovation is a very misunderstood word, and one of the big challenges actually as relates to systems is that there's a lot of apps sold as being innovative, which contain no new thinking at all. They're a well-known method packaged up into an app, and very similar to what you were saying. For me, that isn't innovation. Innovation falls into two areas for me. The first one is around, and the most commonly encountered one actually, is around efficiency. It's figuring out ways to do a thing in a way that costs less time, less money, less effort. And that's a very valid form of innovation, and it's an important form of innovation, but most social innovation is primarily around effectiveness. instead of efficiency. And this is one of the big challenges, is we're actually quite an efficiency-focused culture. The whole Anglo world is a very efficiency-focused culture. And one of the challenges of jumping to effectiveness is actually it can be harder. You know, we're doing something that's less efficient, but is much, much more effective. And this difference is a really important part of it. So for me, the root of social innovation is about finding more effective ways for each individual to collaborate in and with others, in create these positive sum connections and create this ongoing thriving rather than a series of transactions.
Yeah, there's so much can be said about that in terms of you can correlate this to even like music playing, where a typical shredding guitar player will count themselves as good based on the number of notes they can squeeze in per minute, versus actually feeling the note and it being resonant to the actual emotion of the end listener. So what is the typical product or outcome of social innovation, you would say?
Well, social innovation in terms of end product is completely open, because the product is just a vehicle for the change, and the product might change over time. So the exact product of a specific, of social innovation as a general practice could be anything. The production of artifacts is kind of by the by, and is not the primary place where value is delivered. In many ways, it's about not really changing products in any significant way, but producing them in a better way, and opening up new possibility within that. So in a sense, maybe possibility, opportunity is the unified product. That's the one thing that all social innovation generates.
So if you go, for example, if you deal with a client who wants you to do your magic with them, and let's say you bring in the social innovation magic, what is the product typically that you would see? That's what I'm trying to get to.
Okay. For me,
what's the outcome of your particular, social innovation practice? Let's say if you engage with a client for 6 months, what could be a typical pre and post state of the client?
Sure. So for them, it very much depends on the stage, and this is always an iterative process and a cyclic process. So it's about how far they want to get through the cycle and where they want to go. So the first part is that connection with self, is understanding your own purpose and being really grounded in that. The second bit is connecting with other people and being able to articulate, really what that is that you want to do. The next part is having a good plan and being able to kind of work out what the steps are. And the final point is being able to execute on that plan. So for anyone I'd work with is to move them forwards around that cycle, whatever that cycle means for them. So that might well be doing some personal work and helping them connect with, their own history, their own experiences, and what they're doing around that. It might be community building work and helping people articulate exactly what it is that they're trying to do, and the kind of people, trying to reach the kind of people that they want to work with who share their own struggle. Then it might be agile and planning, putting together some agile prototyping and some quick prototypes and getting stuff out there. And finally, it's about assessing effectiveness and making sure that it's all lined up, and doing some evaluation work. So exactly what form that takes is entirely, again, dependent on the context.
It's always ends up being like a bit of a jazz band, right? There is some theme there, but then you improvise around all the time, right?
Improv is absolutely is a great way of looking at the way that this stuff develops as a metaphor. It's a great one. Musical improv or theatre improv is absolutely, it's a great way to build the capacity to do this stuff as well.
Yeah, it's we had some sad. I grew up on listening to fusion jazz, and we had sad news news recently of Chick Corea, one of the greatest pianists in history, passing away. And what ended up happening is I ended up listening to a bunch of Chick Corea, and then through that, YouTube ended up playing me a Miles Davis concert. And it was actually realized, oh, I'm only for the first time ever watching a Miles Davis concert on a sort of video. And this guy would just kind of rock up to the bass player and start playing trumpet towards him. And, you know, whatever he plays is expecting, without saying anything, of course, expecting the bass player to just kind of play that back, you know, in his own kind of interpretation. And at any point in time, Miles Davis might go up to any one of these players and they're like ready to sort of respond to that, and usually in very, very sort of cool ways. So that I actually learned something from watching a Miles Davis concert in that sense. And do you usually typically work with individuals or organizations, or both?
I work with both. Typically, it tends to be, this work is always personal. So I don't work with organizations kind of in general, but I might well work with people in an organizational context. Some of it is always going to be held by a person. And it's interesting, you should use the Miles Davis example, you know, as someone who's bringing together all those threads. You know, that's what social innovators do, this kind of weaving together into something new. So, but you do need a person to hold that and express that. So it's not something that you can apply to an organization in the abstract. It's got to be about individual, real people doing what they actually really want to do.
And so what's then impact of social innovation on money?
So it's an interesting one, money, because this work is always unproven. So we don't actually know what it's going to do. And it can be extremely lucrative, or it can be yield absolutely nothing in terms of material return at all. And it's very, very hard to predict, if not impossible to predict. Maybe you can forecast, but not predict, whether anything in this space is actually going to do that with money. So one of the big challenges that we face with this work is, how do we fund it? And it sits outside the existing funding models, like the charity funding model. It's like, well, what are you going to do with the money? I don't know. We're going to experiment and something will turn up. No, right? We're going to talk to someone who'll give us a definite outcome, even though the range of possibility with exploring is much, much greater, and there's a better yield. Or we go with the, you know, with the strong commercial element, you know, the full commercial element. It's like, what's our ROI? I don't know. You know, we can't know. We can't tell you. You can't tell you with any honesty. You can make it up, but that's really not the way I like to conduct business. So, and a lot of people do, you know, whenever you talk to any startup, you know, a business plan isn't a plan. I really like the book Rework, I think by Jason Fried. And in that he suggests replacing everything that says plan with guess. You know, it's not a business plan, it's a business guess. And that's actually a much more accurate way of looking at this work. So money is a really interesting thing, and a lot of the tools around money are a really interesting thing, and our assumptions about money and what it's for are a really interesting thing. And for me, fundamentally, like all technology, money is a human technology, and potentially a really useful one. But like all technology, it should be in service of us. It should be in service of humanity, instead of us being in service of it. And so for me, this is kind of about taming money on some level.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned Rework, because I don't personally, I can see behind you, you know, you've got loads of books, you've got a personal library. I can imagine you being quite an avid reader, whereas when I was younger, I would read books, but it was mostly during the war in Bosnia, where there was no other choice. It was under candlelight and stuff. But I went away from reading books more and more, and just kind of absorb information through podcasts and YouTube videos, and sort of parallel sort of while I'm doing some design work, I'll be listening to a presentation or something like that. But the funny story about the rework book is that was one rare book that I actually bought. And then what happened, it was like something like the subtitle of rework is like anti-MBA or something like that. And my best man, he is an MBA, and he said, what's this book? What's this book? I said, it's anti-MBA. He goes, can I read it? Can I read it? It's like, sure. And he basically stole that from me effectively and never returned it. So I, like, one rare book that I bought was stolen from me by an MBA who said, oh my God, this is exactly like, oh, this like blew my mind. I was like, yeah, I got it because I kind of like already know what he's written about it because I've followed Jason Friedman for a long time. But yeah, it's like meetings. You should never have meetings unless there is a purpose to them and a goal towards achieving something, which still seems to be meetings for the sake of meetings, although I find the pandemic has kind of destroyed that paradigm quite a bit. Do you find similar kind of thing? Or?
I mean, I think we're getting a little bit better at it. What's interesting for me is actually I'd extend that to all work functions. I think if you can't hook up, like, why are you doing this? Why do it?
Yeah, exactly.
And I think, that's true of meetings, but that's true of everything.
Yeah.
Like, and so much of work is actually, at the moment for me, in large organizations, it doesn't really have much of a point at all. Meetings are just the obvious manifestation of it. But yeah, I completely agree. And I think there have been an awful lot of bad things that have come out of the current situation, but one of the good things is a shakedown of what we really value.
Yeah.
What really matters.
Yeah.
And this work is about connecting to that as well.
And so when it comes to then growth, what can you say about growth in respect to social innovation and the work that you do?
So this is very much again, growth is an interesting one, because this isn't about hyper growth and hyper scale. Potentially it's about
scaling.
Exactly. Because you only need to do that when you're kind of chasing something unsustainable, when there's this closing window and you've got to kind of, you've got to beat everyone else and kind of win and take all of the stuff. And that's not the way that we're working here. We're working about making some stuff for you and making some stuff for other people as well. So for me, growth is very much about connection and building this connection and building a sustainable platform, and a more robust, resilient platform. Robust is probably the wrong word, because flexibility is important too. So a more resilient platform that can learn and can adapt. I think Nicholas Nassim Taleb's idea around anti-fragile is interesting here, because for me, like, thriving growth is about being anti-fragile. Is about becoming more capable of dealing with the unexpected and being able to push out positively into it. So that's what growth means to me, a platform, an increasingly broad, increasingly strong platform to carry on and change the work.
That's one thing that's super interesting about this conversation is that every area we went through, you triggered a experiential moment in my life that I have to share, if nothing else, just for the entertainment purposes. But now you mentioned Nicholas Nassim Taleb. The other thing that I've really been subscribed to is the Black Swan paradigm or theory. And one of the rare kind of big people that I followed on Twitter is Nicholas Nassim Taleb. And at one point he tweeted something, and I'm paraphrasing because his language is very tricky, but he said something like, I trust Trump more than I trust other people that are doing all this kind of war mongering technologies, because at least Trump has his name on his business, right? So he's got skin in the game by the inheritance of the fact that Trump is on his towers and all this kind of stuff, right? And I replied to him saying, and watch this is in context of anti-fragile Nassim Taleb. I said, wouldn't it be nicer if everyone was just working towards more peaceful, sustainable sense-making things that help everyone. And then what he ended up doing, he replied to me with one word, imbecile, and and blocked me on my Twitter, on Design Company Twitter, on Integral Twitter, and all the associated Twitter accounts.
I think, and this is a really interesting thing in this space, and yeah, I kind of doesn't surprise me at all. Is that
and everyone else has said that, but and then people said, "You're famous, Nicola. Nassim Taleb has responded to you."
Is that, like, some people can be really good in one domain, they can be really knowledgeable in one domain, and have absolutely no idea about, you can have a huge, have an incredible sense about prediction and probability and the limits of that, but no idea how power works. And not understanding the relationships of power, and yeah, you can be great in one domain and be really problematic in another domain. And I think that's actually a really interesting thing for this idea of growth, is how can you be better across all of the domains that matter to you, not just picking one and maximizing it.
Good. And so I found myself in this really weird position where, I, up until that point in time, I really liked the guy, and I sort of like had him in my mind as almost like an idol, right? Because it's like every time I made big money, I made it through a black swan tactic. And then he did that to me on Twitter. And I was like, actually, maybe this guy really is a bit of a, he's got literally some huge blind spots. It's funny because, even I think it's an interesting thing. Obviously, he's a very smart guy, but he called COVID pandemic not a black swan, because we kind of always knew something like this was coming. Whereas I noticed that in the media, for example, most other people call it black swan. It's like,
but by his definition, and by the, even actually by the definition of, he's referencing Karl Popper in the black swan thing. This idea, where the idea comes from is, that you could have held the hypothesis for years and years that all swans were white, and then we went to Australia, black swans. So it's like this idea that there have been no examples before, and this is a very interesting one with reference to the social innovation, is that very often we know somewhere in the network, someone knows. And with COVID, people knew. People who were doing the research knew, people on the ground in the places knew stuff that didn't spread, didn't connect with how people are experiencing things, how people are understanding things, and how people are behaving. But someone knew. And the fact that we couldn't adapt fast enough to be able to prevent everything from as it has, is absolutely, for me, one of the core reasons we should be doing social innovation. Because how we spread that knowledge throughout the network, something's gone wrong. We can do something, we can explore, we can send some resources here, we can look at this before it becomes so big that it tips and spreads harm throughout the network, is actually a really, really important function of this work. And that is the other side of why we should work with these more marginalized people who have this perspective, this extra perspective that tends to lead to social innovation. The answer for those of us in the happy mainstream, where we are in the happy mainstream, is because if we want that happy mainstream to continue, we need people to be socially innovating.
Now you made me like really think about lots of different things, because I've been very much in the positions of being socially marginalized, as a refugee from Bosnia, came to UK with no English, no real knowledge of the world at large. I thought that our, 250,000 hometown, was the center of the world. And then I came to London and it was like, my God, this is like literally 100 times larger or something like that. And how am I ever going to even comprehend the city? And actually it took me, I still can't really claim that I really understand the city of London alone, let alone the world at large. But I felt about, it took me about 10 years to acclimatize to London, to understand, okay, maybe this is, actually, I started really comprehending London when I started thinking of it as entire Bosnia, because Bosnia is 4.2 million people all in. So I thought, if I think of this place as Bosnia times 2, then as much as I'm able to comprehend Bosnia, which I can't, and there's a super complicated history, it's like I can't really comprehend London either. And that's just the nature of nature. And that's that. What can you say about that, like comprehensibility of social structures?
And this is one of the really big challenges, is that it is beyond that kind of deterministic knowing. And one of the things I often use in my work is complexity theory. It's actually one of the foundational parts of social innovation as a practice. And the definition of a complex system is it's beyond computation. The quickest way to find out what a complex system does is to run it, is to let it do its thing. We can't work out faster than the system's running what it's going to do. But what's interesting is we are human, and we've developed and evolved a whole load of systems for working with this living thing. And one of the ways to know you're doing social innovation is if you're working with something that kind of has a life of its own, or does actually have a life of its own. If you're working with people, they have a life of its own. If you're working with an organization, it kind of has a life of its own. It's the things that kind of go off and do their thing without you intending, without your direction. And so we get this felt sense of the thing. We're embodied in it, in its context, and we feel into the change. And that's actually how we work with these systems. And that's how we can forecast on a qualitative level. That's how we know it's good or bad. It's going in the right direction or it's going in the wrong direction. And when we work with something and spend time with it, we develop expertise in it, felt sense expertise. We know something's wrong, even if we can't name it. And then we can respond to that feeling, and we figure out what it is later on. And the same token, it's for spotting opportunity. We know it smells right, so we go towards it. That smells good. It's that kind of sense. And we can move towards it. And then you're like, oh yeah, that's why I did that. But we can't do it beforehand. And that bringing that intuition part into the work is a really, really important way of engaging with the level of complexity that we're working in. And a city is absolutely a great example of a complex system. No one can know all of the city. No one can know everyone's lives and everything that's evolved and predict it. But we can get a sense of it. We can feel the flow of it. We can feel the energy of it and how it works on that intrinsic level, even if we can't specifically predict the details.
Yeah, there's so many parameters. I mean, one of the guys that I actually coached in the past, he came from Spain, and he literally interviewed with me without knowing English. He came into the interview with an English dictionary. And I thought, like, at that point in time, I used that sensing thing of thinking, well, this guy is either completely like crazy, as in bad way crazy, or he's crazy in the good way, as in he's had the audacity to turn up to the interview while knowing that he doesn't speak English. So he said, I'm willing to work here for free and I'll learn English within the next 3 months, blah, blah, blah. And I said, okay, let's give him a chance. I put him on like a minimal salary and so on. And he now works at Amazon, like working on, what's it called? The talking interfaces like Alexa.
Yeah.
And he, at one point, he actually went through a exercise of walking every single street of London and taking pictures. So he had like bought one of those big maps of London and went every day for like 10, 20 kilometer walk and crossed out the road that he walked and ended up covering the whole London map. And, he would be coming to me every day to the office, say, have you seen, this place in this road, in this street here? And I said, no, I don't. But then he would point me some places that I did know. And he goes, this is a really nice place. And I said, yeah, but there you get like a lot of stabbings. And, there's all this kind of like, it's like nice buildings, but very bad. And so he didn't know that kind of social context that I didn't know, but I didn't know some of the kind of locations that he found out. And it was all this kind of, I was weirdly through a proxy learning about London through his pictures that he had just kind of walked through unbeknownstly to him, and it's such a weird thing. And we're still very much in touch, and he's developed so much to the point where I was coaching and mentoring him before. Now he can coach and mentor me. And I'm like, this is such a weird thing. But yeah, so what's kind of like a final thought, to close it off from you on social innovation and kind of what came to you from this conversation?
Yeah, no, I very much enjoyed the conversation. Thank you very much. It's always kind of insightful and interesting talking to you. And I think one of the markers of someone who can do this really well is when I find myself saying things that I didn't think I knew.
Yes.
And that's, for me, that's a real important and undervalued skill, the ability to ask questions, good questions. And I think perhaps if there's anything that I'm, for others to take away and for me to take away, is think about the questions that you're asking. Think about the questions that you're asking in the work that you do, and why you're asking those questions, why those matter to you and to the people you care about. Because ultimately, that's the root of all the stuff that we're going to change. And the more people who are doing this work, whether they do it as their primary work or whether they do it as a part of their work, the better off we all are. So whether you listen to this and go, oh yeah, I really want to get stuck into social innovation, or you're like, yeah, I can see that's important, but it's not the main thing I want to do. Do a bit of it. Get out there, play with it, and do what matters, and do what matters to you. Give yourself that space to try something different.
And that thing that you mentioned about saying things that you didn't know you knew, it's technically called in psychology unthought known. So you know it, but you've never thought about it.
Never articulated it.
And when it clicks, it's like, I didn't know I knew this, but you kind of have to speak about it to know consciously that you knew it unconsciously. So it's always cool. And where can people find you and your company and what you're doing?
Yeah, so at the moment, I work simply under my own name, so MatthewBellringer.com, and you can look up Matthew Bellringer on LinkedIn. There isn't a huge amount of other Matthew Bellringers on LinkedIn. You'll be surprised to hear. So I used to be able to say I'm the only one, but I'm not anymore, which is kind of disappointing. So you can find my work there. I do a regular podcast and show live web stream called Delightful Dissent, where I talk to people who are doing this kind of work and challenging these assumptions. So that would be a really good thing for people to check out first, I think. Yeah, take a look at Delightful Dissent if you're interested in more of the work that I do.
Awesome. And, I can never get tired of publicly and formally, just stating the fact that I think you're just absolutely top guy, both as a human soul being, all these kind of things. And, absolutely love you to bits, man. And thank you so much for, once again, talking about your infinite wisdom that even you, get to learn more about having.
This is it. And it's always learning. And that's the fun thing. And that's why I love talking to you, is I learn loads as well. So it's great. We're awesome. we're doing exactly the kind of thing we're talking about as we're doing it, which is
right. Cool. Thank you so much. Cheers.
Great. Thank you.